Altair, Apple Floppy Days, Commodore, Tandy Floppy Days, Atari, TI Floppy Days. The weekend comes, the disk drive hums, ready to code for you. These days we're all happy and free. Those floppy days, the games we play, you shared with me. Those days, Motorola, Intel 6502, graphics and text are there to view. Composite, color, or RGB, program fun for you and me.
Floppy Days is recorded in a live studio.
Inside PC Floppy Days, SD Amiga Floppy Days, Junior Sinclair Floppy Days, Classic Days, Microwaves, geeking all week with you. These days we're all happy and free. Those floppy days, the games we play, you shared with me. Those days, these floppy days are yours and mine. These floppy days are yours and mine. Floppy days.
The TRS-80 Model 3.
Introducing the Apple IIc.
Atari 1040 ST. Commodore 64.
PC Junior, new from IBM.
Discover Atari.
At his Radio Shack Color Computer 3,
Introducing the Timex Sinclair 1000.
For computer, this is the one. Texas Instruments home computer.
a wonder computer of the 1980s, the Commodore VIC-20.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode 123 of Floppy Days for February 2023, where classic computers are all the rage, and we lovingly take you back to the days when computers were simpler and we were younger. This is a special show for me because this month, February 17th was the actual date, marks the 10th anniversary of publishing this podcast. Man, oh man, where's the time gone? This podcast itself has become vintage, depending on your definition of vintage. My original intent was to continue the coverage of the ZX Spectrum this month, but my special co-host for that show was unable to record this month. I decided this was the perfect opportunity to have a special show to in some way commemorate the 10th anniversary. My co-host and I have scheduled the recording for the Spectrum show for early March, so I'll publish that as early in March as I can. In the meantime, for this show, I wanted to talk about how this show has changed and grown over the years and what my plans are for the future. I apologize for not having one of my two typical formats, either machine coverage or interview, for this show. Not to worry though, I've got what I think is an interesting story around my recent work to test and set up some Amiga 1000s that have come my way, including some information about a great upgrade for the Amiga 1000 called the Parceiro 2. I do also want to mention that I now have some sponsors for Floppy Days. 8-Bit Classics, run by my friend Corey Colts, is a great place to get vintage computer items. This includes video cables, power supplies, PC boards, cartridges, upgrades, and more for a wide variety of vintage computer platforms. In the new acquisitions section I cover each month on the show, often one of the items I talk about has been ordered from 8-Bit Classics. Corey has been a friend of the show for some time, and I really appreciate his support of the podcast. Check out the site, he has some great stuff. ArcadeShopper.com, run by my friend Greg McGill, is another terrific site to get vintage computer items. Greg has a wide variety of hard-to-find items for a large number of platforms. This is another site that I do and have done a lot of shopping at and have mentioned numerous times on Floppy Days. If anything shows out of stock, just ping Greg through the contact form and he can check whether he has or can get more of the item for you. I also want to mention those listeners who appreciate the show enough to donate through Patreon.com. This includes Chris Petzel, Tony Capolini, Richard Goldstone, Josh Malone, Andy Collins, Simon McCullough, Jason Moore, Quentin Barnes, and someone who goes by the handle Lawrence. I'm not sure of that person's real name. I really appreciate you guys, and it helps offset the cost of running this podcast. On a sad note, one other thing I wanted to talk about was the passing of a good friend in the community, James Shackle, also known as Air Shack. James passed from this earth in January of this year due to illness, and it was a shock to me to realize I would no longer have James to talk to. James came from the TI community, but was interested in a lot of the vintage machines. Over the years, I traded a Sinclair ZX Spectrum Plus 2A to him for a Tippy network card for the TI-99, and James sent me numerous things, such as books or software. Most recently, just 3 months ago actually, I traded a Commodore 128 to him for an Atari 1200 XL. He also had been a Patreon donor for Floppy Days for some time. He pinged me all the time to discuss Antique or Floppy Days, or just to let me know about some new vintage computer thing he came across. I saw James at Tandy Assembly in October last year, just the second time I had ever seen him in person, but he never told me he was ill. James had a singular sense of humor, and I will miss it and him very much. It reminds me that we need to appreciate the people around us while we can, as we don't know how long they will be around. James, I will truly miss you. Okay, let's get on with the show. I hope you find something interesting out of this episode, and here's to 10 more years of Floppy Days.
This is Michael Tomchek. I've been called the marketing father of the home computer, and you're listening to the Floppy Days broadcast.
I'm Neil Harris. I was a member of the VIC-20 launch team, affectionately known as the VIC Commandos, and you're listening to Floppy Days.
Hi, I'm Stuart Chaffee, host and executive producer of the Computer Chronicles television series. You're listening to me on the Floppy Days podcast, hosted by Randy Kindig.
Okay, now for new acquisitions and what I've been up to. First of all, I acquired a deck of computer trading cards. These are pretty cool. They came from 8bitkick.cc originally. I actually bought them off of eBay. A still sealed deck of cards. It's a pretty cool deck of cards. It has 42 retro computers in it. It's got 8-bit classics. It's got some 16-bit and 32-bit early machines such as the Commodore Amiga, ST, Acorn Archimedes, and so on. All the standard machines, both European and American, that you've probably heard of. Each card features a cool retro machine and its vital statistics. It includes information like the CPU model and data width, as well as clock frequency in megahertz, amount of RAM that came with the machine, the display, the maximum display resolution, the maximum color palette, and the year of launch. So it's not a lot of information, but it's just some of the very basic information. Anyway, I found these very interesting, and it's just something to keep around and take a look at once in a while. I suppose you could probably create a game out of this using the cards, but very cool. Give it a look. I also acquired another computer. I don't know when I'm going to quit doing this, but the MSX line of computers is one of those that I've always wanted to get one of, and I've been looking for some time to try to find one. Didn't really care that much whether it was an MSX 1, 2, because I know there were different versions of MSX machines. But I ended up finding one eventually. I got one off of eBay. It's a Yamaha MSX AX150 Sacker computer. Has both Arabic and English, and has 64K of RAM, has an MSX1 compatible video display processor, has a Yamaha YM2220 for audio, 2 cartridge slots, an Arabic keyboard, built-in power supply. So I will definitely talk about this machine and MSX machines in general in more detail on a future show. It's on my timeline. But now I have an MSX computer to actually play with and get comfortable with and be ready for when it comes time to talk about it on the show. The second thing that I acquired was also for the MSX computer, and it is an upgrade for it. It is called the Memory Mapper plus SD card interface. I bought mine off of arcadeshopper.com, which is one of the show sponsors. But it's basically an SD mapper and Mega RAM 512 KB expansion interface. It expands your MSX up to 512 kilobytes and uses an SD card as a hard disk, and you can have one as large as 8 gigabytes. It's fully compatible with all the MSX models, including the MSX 1, 2, and 2 Plus. There are 2 actual slots for SD cards that support 4 gig each. There's a mapper mode that will add 512K of memory mapper to your MSX. So it will allow it to run the Nextdoor DOS 2, even on an MSX 1, which you typically would not be able to do. There are some new commands and new functionality with Nextdoor DOS 2, and gives you the ability to have subdirectories so you can navigate on the SD card as a hard disk in the FAT16 format for easy file exchange with the PC. And it has a Mega RAM mode so that the 512 KB can be a Mega RAM that allows games that need the additional RAM. So that's it for the MSX stuff. Okay, and now for my Amiga 1000 story as part of new acquisitions and really more about what I've been up to. As part of the great barn find of 2022, which I talked about on previous shows, I came across not just one, but 2 Amiga 1000s in great shape and no apparent damage. One was even in the original undamaged box and included a memory upgrade board, the 1080 monitor, and external floppy drive. Now, the Amiga 1000 is one of those things I've always secretly wanted. I have an Amiga 500, and while I haven't done a lot with it yet, it seems to be a great machine. It is a big machine, however, and takes a lot of desk space. I rather like the 2-piece design of the Amiga 1000 with a main CPU and a separate keyboard. Besides, the Amiga 1000 was the first in the line of several Amiga models. The fact that I found 2 great representatives of that model was one of the highlights of the barn find. So one of the things I decided to do recently was to do full testing of both machines just to see where things stood. I really hoped that they were fully functional, as my goal was to keep one machine and find a good home for the other. I had no idea of the time commitment I was making in undertaking this endeavor. It turned out that both machines booted and came up asking for a kickstart disk, which was a good sign. For those unfamiliar with the Amiga, Commodore released the Amiga 1000 to boot off of 2 different floppies. First, the kickstart disk that essentially booted the core operating system, and then a workbench disk to load the UI. Later machines, like the Amiga 500, had kickstart in ROM and would only ask for the workbench disk. Well, guess what? There were 0 floppies included with either machines, even the boxed one, and that means I didn't have a kickstart disk. My first thought was to create a kickstart disk on the Amiga 500, but I had a problem there. It only had the built-in floppy drive. I had both an external Gotek drive and a virtual hard disk device that I had purchased for the Amiga 500, but neither had been hooked up or tested. That means I didn't really have any way currently to get a Kickstart disk image onto the Amiga 500 so I could create a real Kickstart disk for the Amiga 1000. I made an attempt to get both the Gotek and the virtual hard disk working on the Amiga 500, but ran into issues with both and didn't want to go down the rabbit hole right now of trying to get those things working. I wanted to continue my work with the Amiga 1000. So I put the Amiga 500 work aside for a later time. So enter the Parceiro. A friend of mine told me about the Parceiro after I told him I was testing the Amiga 1000s. And after looking it up, it seemed like the ideal upgrade for the machine. This device was created by Amiga hobbyist and now retired once CIO of the United States Space Force, David Dunkley. An ardent fan of the Amiga 1000, David designed the Parceiro to help bring this system up to speed with other members of the Amiga family. The Parceiro consists of a circuit board sitting in a removable plastic enclosure. It attaches to the Amiga 1000's side bus expander connector and offers the following features. It gives you 8 megabytes of auto-configuring fast RAM, where the original Amiga 1000 shipped with just 256K, a micro SD card reader supporting a bundled 2 gigabyte micro SD card formatted as a FAT32 volume, allowing it to be read or written on a PC or Mac for moving files, using in an emulator, and so on. Also has the capability of auto-loading whatever version of Workbench you want loaded, and that's selectable. A real-time clock with onboard battery backup, and a driver allowing it to be recognized by Amiga DOS at boot, and an optional daughterboard mod for the Amiga 1000 for auto-booting the Kickstart from ROM. And he includes the parts for doing that mod if you want to do that. So I contacted David and found him to be a very responsive, helpful, terrific guy who was willing to help me not only get a Parceiro, but also help in troubleshooting the machines and getting the Parceiro set up. When I told him about my Kickstart disk issue, he offered to send me a Kickstart disk with the Parceiro order so I could continue my testing. And I received the device a few days later. I'm going to refer to the Amiga 1000s as Amiga number 1 and Amiga number 2. When I tested Amiga number 1, it booted all the way up to Workbench without the Parceiro. No issues there. However, with the Parceiro, it was unstable. It would just reboot itself after a few seconds, actually, of sitting at the Workbench desktop. For Amiga number 2, it would ask for the Kickstart disk and read it, but then never ask for the Workbench disk. After talking with David, again, he was very responsive and helpful. He thought there was likely a problem with chips on the daughter board on Amiga number 1 and a disk drive issue on Amiga number 2. He suggested swapping the daughter board from Amiga number 2 to Amiga number 1. For anyone that's taken an Amiga 1000 apart, they know just how many screws one has to remove to get down to the motherboard. I watched more than one video to make sure I was dismantling the machine correctly. The daughter board is even more of an issue as it has multiple connection points to the motherboard, including screws and pin connectors. However, I did the daughter board swap, and Amiga number 1 now fully worked with the Parceiro. What a great device and fun machine. David includes some parts that allow you to modify the daughter board so that Kickstart can be booted from ROM, and then the Parceiro automatically loads Workbench to give you a floppy diskless boot. I wasn't comfortable with doing the daughter board mod myself, so David offers a free service where he will do the mod or send you an already modified daughter board if you send him your daughter board. In this case, he also offered to test the floppy disk mechanism from Amiga number 2 if I included it in the box. I went that route. Within 24 hours after receiving the package, he had modified the daughter board, tested it, and tested the floppy disk mechanism. He found no issue with the floppy drive, so there may still be an issue with Amiga number 2 regarding its inability to boot. I'll do more testing once I receive the modded daughter board and drive. I'm waiting for those now, so there's still a lot of time that I'll be spending on this. However, I'm really pumped to currently having a fully working Amiga 1000 with Parceiro upgrade and the possibility of getting a second one working as well. That's my Amiga story to date. I'll continue to update everyone as I work through this. And that's it for new acquisitions and what I've been up to this month.
This is Lee Felsenstein, designer of the Osborne 1, the Sol 20, a number of other things, and a relic of the old homebrew days of personal computing. You're listening to the Floppy Days podcast.
Hello, I'm Steve Ferber. I'm a professor of computer engineering at the University of Manchester in the UK, and I'm talking about the time I spent in the 1980s at Acorn Computers in Cambridge, developing the BBC Micro and the early versions of the ARM microprocessor. And you're listening to Floppy Days.
All right, so hi, this is Ed Smith. I'm the person who was a part of the video game and personal computer design team at APF Electronics in New York. We developed the MP1000 video game, and we developed the Imagination Machine personal computer. And I am happy to say that this has been an excellent discussion with Randy on the Floppy Days podcast.
Okay, now for upcoming shows. We've got quite a few shows coming up this year because we're so early in the year. All the shows really start in April and continue through the remainder of the year. So there's a lot of shows coming up, particularly in the April timeframe. The first one is the Midwest Gaming Classic, which is March 31st through April 2nd at the Wisconsin Center in Wisconsin, Milwaukee. VCF East will be April 14th through the 16th at the InfoAge Science and History Museums in Wall, New Jersey. The same weekend will be the Commodore Los Angeles Super Show, April 15th through the 16th at the Burbank VFW Hall in Burbank, California. The very next weekend, April 22nd through the 23rd, will be the 31st annual Last Cocoa Fest at the Holiday Inn and Suites in Carroll Stream, Illinois. The first Indie Classic Computer and Video Game Expo will be the final weekend of April 29th and 30th at the Crown Plaza Airport Hotel in Indianapolis, Indiana. In June will be the Pacific Commodore Expo Northwest, June 24th through the 25th at the Interim Computer Museum in Seattle, Washington. Kansas Fest, the largest and longest running annual Apple II conference, will be July 18th through the 23rd at Rockhurst University in Kansas City, Missouri. Also in July, the Southern Fried Gaming Expo will be July 28th through the 30th in Atlanta, Georgia. This will also include the Vintage Computer Festival Southeast as part of the Southern Fried Gaming Expo. And then finally, as far as confirmed shows for this year, will be the Portland Retro Gaming Expo, October 13th through the 15th at the Oregon Convention Center in Portland, Oregon. And that's it for shows that are confirmed for 2023.
Hi, this is John Grant. I've wrote the BASIC and the other things in the ZX80 ROM. These days I'm working on things for 5G, new mobile, and trying to bring to today's digital systems something as new as we had back in the days of the ZX80. And you're listening to the Floppy Days podcast.
Okay, this is Howell Ivey, the designer of the Sorcerer computer and one of the owners of Exity. And you are listening to the Floppy Days podcast.
Hi, I'm Amiga Bill Winters from thegurumeditation.org, and you're listening to Floppy Days.
Okay, and now we're getting into the special content around the 10th anniversary of the show. As I said earlier in the show, in honor of the 10th anniversary, I wanted to give everyone a quick update on the state of the podcast, as well as information around where things might go. Please understand that one of my primary goals here is to get feedback concerning the show direction. I very much want to know what you think, and if you like my proposed vision for the future of the podcast. First of all, I'm going to start out with some numbers. I apologize if you find this a little dry. I just want to give you an idea of what sort of download traffic I'm seeing, and which gives me an idea of the popularity of the show and whether I'm concentrating on the right things or not. So, I've had 341,000 downloads for the show in these 10 years as of today. That is for 122 shows. Now, some of the episodes were actually special episodes. They might have been ads for Tandy Assembly. They might have been shows that were leading up to a particular show somewhere and talking with someone about what the show was going to be about. And talking about computer show, not podcast show. So that's an average of about 3,000 downloads per episode. And that has been the average for some time. Now, in general, I think 3,000 downloads per episode is pretty good in the vintage computer arena. It's not a large community. You have a lot of people that are interested more in gaming than they are in computers. I don't really focus on games. So I think 3,000 downloads per episode is pretty good. And I get about 1,000 downloads in the first month for every single episode that I publish. So again, I think that's pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. Now, what are some of the most popular shows that I've done? Well, the Acorn Atom show, for some reason, is by far and away the most popular show downloaded. It has almost 10,000 downloads for that episode, and that is double the next most popular episode. Again, I don't know why that is, but I'd certainly like to know what the secret sauce is behind that episode and why so many people were interested in that. Next up, a couple of VIC-20 shows were very popular. The VIC-20 History Show and the interview with Michael Tomchek, as well as VIC-20 Part 1. So VIC-20 shows, Commodore VIC-20 shows, I don't know if it's because of Commodore. There actually also was the interview with Brian Bagnall. So there's 4 of the top 6 episodes were around the Commodore VIC-20. So either the VIC-20 is extremely popular or because it was a Commodore topic. And I know the Commodore community is pretty large out there. Also spattered in there was the Atari 400-800 Part 1 show was in the top 6. And then we get into the Mize for the TRS-80 Model 1 by Peter Bartlett. That one continues to be and always has been in the top 10 at one point in time, and actually was the top 1 for a long time. So there apparently was a lot of interest in the Model 1. The Apple II Part 1 is in the top 10, as well as the Week of the K-Fest that was done by Mike Whalen. And then another TRS-80 Model 1, this time the Part 2 of that coverage. So Model 1, TRS-80 Model 1, the Apple II, the VIC-20, and the Acorn Atom were the shows that really, and the Atari 400-800 were the shows that were most popular. The least popular shows, any pre-computer show coverage. So for a while there, I was having shows leading up to a computer show, and those did not seem to be very popular. It kind of makes sense because you would get downloads for those leading up to the show, but once the show is over with, there probably wouldn't be any additional downloads because that show is done, right? So why listen to a pre-computer show coverage episode? Whereas other episodes that cover a particular computer or that have an interview could be downloaded at any time and still be relevant. And then some the other least popular shows, interviews with less well-known people. So that gives you an idea of what the most popular episodes were. As far as an interview summary, I had a lot of interview shows over time. As I look back at it and I look at some of the key interviews, it's like, wow, I am really impressed myself with some of the interviews that I've been able to get over time, over these last 10 years. And really proud of some of these interviews that I've been able to get. For instance, I'm going to run down through about 16 key interviews that I was able to get. Hal Ivey, the developer of the Exidy Sorcerer. John Grant, who was involved in the development of the OS for the ZX80 and 81 and did some work on the Spectrum as well. Joe DeCure, who did development of the Atari 400-800 and the Amiga 1000. So tapped into Joe a couple of times for all the great work that he did. Leonard Trammell, obviously from the famous Trammell family that owned Commodore and then Atari. He did some work on the Atari ST. Ed Smith, who developed the APF Imagination Machine. Herman Hauser, and Steve Ferber, both, who did development on the BBC Micro. Ed Lagerquist, who was the editor of Seaload and Chromaset magazines for the TRS-80, both Model 1 and color computer. Lee Felsenstein, who developed the Osborne 1. Stuart Chaffee, the very famous host of Computer Chronicles. Neil Harris and Michael Tomchak, who did development on the VIC-20. Don French, co-developer of the TRS-80 Model 1. Wayne Green, a very well-known magazine publisher, published Byte and many other magazines. Paul Freiberger and Michael Swain, authors of the book Fire in the Valley. And George Karamedjev, the director and now unfortunately passed away a couple years ago, but the person who created the American Computer Museum in Bozeman, Montana. So that is some of the key interviews that I've done over the years. Again, very proud of those and want to continue getting that type of interview on the podcast. Some interviews that I'm currently talking with people about that I'm really excited about trying to get and I'm very close in getting a couple of these already. Paul Terrell of the Byte Shop. I'm sure you've heard his name, was very involved with the Apple I and selling that initially. Bob Frankston, co-developer of VisiCalc. Sam Trammell, one of the other Trammell brothers. David John Pleasance, Commodore and Amiga author. So those are some of the ones I'm currently working on, and there will be many other interviews that I'll be looking to get. As I talk about particular machines, I definitely will be trying to get people who were involved in the development of the machine or development of software for the machine as I cover those machines. And then also I plan to have shows with interviews of people who've created some interesting or innovative modern upgrades for some of the vintage computers. That's my plans around interviews going forward. So next I want to talk about machine coverage and the future of the show in that regard. As you know, I also cover handheld and programmable calculators, but concerning machine coverage, I have a pretty long list of machines yet that I want to cover. I'm using the oldcomputers.net site as a basis. It has a nice timeline of the introduction of a huge number of home computers. But I have taken that as a basis and created my own timeline of computers and created that runs all the way through 1995. Now the timeline becomes pretty sparse beginning with 1990, as my original intent was to cover home computers through the 80s and not really get into the 90s. Note that I'm not planning to cover all the computers that are listed on the oldcomputers.net timeline. I would definitely never be done with the show if I did that. I chose those computers that seemed the most interesting to me to cover, but I'm always open to feedback on other computers that would make an interesting show. And on occasion, I get suggestions of computers to cover, and I might add them to the timeline. The show is currently early in the year 1982, and the next few years have a lot of computers to cover that are interesting or were impactful. The next several computers to cover include, obviously I need to finish the ZX Spectrum coverage. I want to cover the Grundy New Brain, the Color Genie, the HP 75C calculator / handheld computer, the Dragon 32 and 64, the Commodore 64, the Atari 1200 XL, and the Nabu PC, which has been making the rounds in popularity recently. So those are, as far as the most immediate shows, and probably that will take me through the next year at least, would be those particular platforms. Those, they all sound like a lot of fun. Some of them are going to take a lot of work in order to cover them thoroughly, like the Commodore 64. Obviously there could be 10, 12 shows about the Commodore 64 if I'm not careful about what we cover. But that's the intent for the machines to cover in the near term. All right, other possible topics. I have some additional special topics separate from interviews that I really would like to cover at some point. These are things that might come up that I think might make an interesting show, maybe are a little bit off the beaten track, a little bit different than some of the standard shows. For instance, thinking about and actually planning on doing an episode around the Bally Astrocade game machine, but using it as a computer, similar to the episode that was done with the Intellivision and turning it into a computer that was done with Paul Nurmanen. So that is one that's actually in the works. I thought that would be fun and interesting. Another possible topic would be a Computer Wars episode, and I'd like to get the thoughts of the listeners around this one, but it would be covering some of the major platforms of the day, the Commodore 64, the Atari 8-bit line, the Coco, for instance. I'm still putting parameters around exactly what computers to cover, but have a debate panel. Pick some people who are avid fans of a particular platform, put them together, throw out some incendiary questions, get them to debate what the best home computer of the day was around particular parameters. So I think that would be a lot of fun, but let me know if you think that would be fun or not. Other topics might come up over time, but those are some of the special topics that I'm thinking of covering in the near term.
This is Bill Kemper, and I worked on the HP 85, did the standard pack, and managed the software development group for the Series 80 from 77 until probably about 85, I worked on Series 80. You're listening to Floppy Days Podcast. Thanks a lot.
Hi, this is Boise Pete, the author of Coco, The Colorful History of Tandy's Underdog Computer, and a general Coco enthusiast, and you're listening to the Floppy Days Podcast.
Hi, this is Brian Bagnall, author of Commodore, A Company on the Edge, and you're listening to Floppy Days.
This is Chris Rutkowski, worked with some of the early pioneering companies in the microcomputer industries, and this is the Floppy Days Podcast.
Okay, now I want to talk about plans for the future, in particular around monetization. Now that I'm retired, I'm really looking to do monetization of some sort in order to continue to fund Floppy Days activities. When I was working, I budgeted a specific amount out of my paycheck to go into my vintage computer hobby fund, but I promised my wife when I retired I would no longer do that and find ways for the hobby to fund itself. Now, costs are not high to produce Floppy Days. The only real cost I can't control is the monthly fee to host and serve the podcast content. And for that, I use Libsyn, a popular player in the market. They have very inexpensive plans. No, the biggest cost is that of continuing to acquire items to discuss. When I discuss a specific computer on the podcast, I really prefer to currently own, or at least in the past have owned, that computer. That, of course, isn't practical for some machines, like the Apple I, obviously, but when possible, I like to be familiar with the real hardware. In addition, I like to talk about new acquisitions on the show, and it seems to be popular with listeners. That primarily consists of modern upgrades, books, or other items, when it's not a new old computer. That particular aspect of the show is the most costly and requires constant attention. It's also a lot of fun. Anyway, enough excuses. That's why I'm looking to find other ways to bring in enough money to fund this insidious hobby. There are lots of possible ways to do that. For instance, I could make published podcast material available early to paying subscribers. The same content would be made available for free, as always, to everyone, but subscribers would get an early listen. One thing I thought about doing is providing some additional content for subscribers that are willing to pay a small amount for the privilege. For instance, when I do interviews going forward, I could post the audio on the Floppy Days podcast feed and post the video behind a firewall for paying subscribers. I haven't worked out exactly how I would do that, but it's a thought. I've also thought about really embracing the more modern video aspect that seems popular today and producing additional video podcasts about some of the machines I've covered and will cover. These video podcasts would cover some of the same topics as the audio podcast, but in an abbreviated form. It would also be a chance to really focus on topics that are hard to cover appropriately with just audio, such as a quick tutorial on using the machine, such as pulling it out of the box, and a quick run-through of modern upgrades in action. These video podcasts would be, or could be, put behind a firewall for paying subscribers. It would take a lot of effort, but I've wanted to get into video for the podcast. Another possibility I still have in mind is I want to write the book that I've talked about on the show before. Essentially, a book that summarizes basic information, as covered on Floppy Days, about each machine or platform while really focusing on usability. Again, my use case is the fact that whenever I sit down at a newly set up machine, even if I've pulled it out before, potentially years ago, I often have no idea how to even get started on using the machine. Each one is different in the way you boot it up, what questions you might have to answer, what it shows on boot up, and how you do simple things on it, like loading software. This book would be a way of documenting in one reference how to do those simple things on the machine without trying to look it up on a YouTube video. I've had feedback from a few listeners that this would be useful to them, so I'm still planning to give it a shot. Besides, I've always wanted to author a book. Well, that's it. That's the future, my future thoughts, my thoughts around where the podcast might go, what the future might be, just some ideas. I really would like to get your feedback concerning any or all of those ideas. Okay, that's it for this podcast. I provided links in the show notes for additional information on any topics that we discussed during this podcast. Go to floppydays.com for the full list. I very much encourage you to provide feedback for the show at Apple Podcasts or on the website, via email at floppydays@gmail.com, via Twitter at floppydays, on the Twitter-like Mastodon at floppydays, at oldbytes.space, on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/floppydays, or on the Discord server, whose link is at floppydays.com. Besides the website and Apple Podcasts, Floppy Days is available for streaming at TuneIn, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Stitcher.com, and Spotify. Until the next show, pull out a vintage computer and compute as if it were yesterday. Bye.